Hi, everyone. It's good to see you all again today. We are happy to welcome our live audience and also the virtual audience that will watch watch the replay later. Happy International Women's Day to everyone on the call and everyone listening. I'm Sabre Collier, visiting fellow with the Skull Center, and I'm really delighted in the spirit of International Women's Day to welcome Natasha Garcia to talk about the Women's Livelihood Bond, which to me is one of the most exciting financial innovations at the intersection of sustainable finance and gender equality that I could even visualize. I'm so excited to talk about this. But first, I will just give some background about Natasha, our guest today. Natasha is the Senior Director of Innovative Finance at the Impact Investment Exchange, a really pioneering women-led investment bank, and I believe advisory company as well, right, Natasha? Natasha works on IIX's gender lens investing initiatives and impact measurement work in Asia Pacific, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the United States. She focuses on structuring impact verification and investor relations for the Women's Livelihood Bond, the world's first gender lens social bond listed on the stock exchange. She also leads the International Capital Markets Association Impact Reporting Working Group for social bonds. Natasha has a Wall Street background. She worked in hedge funds. She also has an impact-driven career. She was the co-founder of the Shades of Happiness Foundation, a nonprofit with the mission to empower children from low-income communities. And of course, she's an esteemed alumni coming back to the fold to share her story. She holds her MBA from the University of Oxford and also a social justice certification from Harvard University. So thank you so much, Natasha. So much to delve into today and to open it. Because it's Women's Day, I was hoping you could open with your reflections on why gender equality is so important to global economic growth and recovery.
Thank you so much for having me, Tara. It's always such a pleasure to be reconnected with my Oxford community. So very excited to speak with you. And you have, of course, a very illustrious career in the impact space as well. So it's always an honor as well to share a space with you. I think it's a fascinating time in the world. We're at a time where you're seeing the world facing a number of complex issues at the same time at a scale that we may have never seen before. Everything from unprecedented climate change, we're seeing geopolitical issues happening in Europe, which has a ripple effect on all of us and is deeply unfortunate violations of human rights and many of them women's rights as well. And we're also seeing the world still reeling and recovering from the COVID pandemic and what that means for the new normal. And the narrative has always been that women are disproportionately affected during these sorts of during any crisis. Gender equality is thrown disproportionately out of bounds, really because women are already in a I would say compromising position economically in particular. Now, I think while all of this is true, we are seeing that women are 1.8 times more likely to lose their job because of COVID. Women are more affected by climate change, especially in emerging markets where climate change is already a reality. You already are adapting to it. And you're seeing, of course, while women may not be the main combatants of any war, they're often the main victims. So it puts us in a space in which we now need to re-ask ourselves, why does this keep recurring? And maybe we should change the whole focus on recognizing that women are maybe not just victims, but we need to recognize that they are part of the solution. They have and always will be fundamental to sustainable development, sustainable peace, and climate action. And I say that because when you do invest in women, we do see from an economic standpoint, the countries that are recovering faster are the ones with better gender equality. We saw this during COVID when there was greater women leadership in government. Countries like New Zealand had better and quicker responses to the crisis, to the pandemic. We're seeing with climate change, when women are financially empowered to shift over to better sources of energy, they take greener decisions. We're seeing if women are part of the conversation in peace tables, both empowered at the grassroots and at the top level, those nations have a 35% more likelihood of honoring peace agreements and having long-lasting peace. So if we are seeing a world where climate, peace, and economic recovery are also interconnected, and we're seeing the common denominator is always women empowerment and gender equality, I think we need to recognize that the biggest way we can change is by rethinking the role of women itself, not as victims anymore. We're not trying to solve the gender gap anymore, but it's women who are going to solve these other gaps.
That is so fascinating. Such a compelling argument. And the stats that you just kept throwing at us. I'm very glad that this will be recorded, because we need to put all of that information in a blog post and get this information out. I had always realized about, the contribution to economic growth, but some of the other points you made about usage of energy choices, and the relationship to peace and stability. It's just, for me, the business case for gender has always been quite clear, but you just hit us over the head with even more firepower for that. And so with that as background for why it's so important to do it, what are you and your organization doing to further gender equality, and what's the business case or commercial angle that is aligning with or complementing the gender impact that we've already started to reference?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's been really fascinating for us is we're a woman-led firm who has been doing impact investing really since the 2008 financial crisis. And we're a firm led by women, and we're a firm based in the global south. And the intersectionality of being women of color, of being women who typically people are trying to solve problems for, is very interesting. When you walk into a room and with full of bankers in black suits, and you say, we're going to do the world's first gender bond, it was an interesting set of reactions that we got. So in 2017, we were the first company in the world to structure and issue a gender bond that eventually became listed on the Singapore Stock Exchange. And I still remember when we did that, a lot of the banking partners, who are wonderful people and very well intentioned, I might add, came to us and said, why don't you just call this a high yield emerging market bond, and we'll sell it really quick. We'll have people who have mandates for that. And we had to really insist, no, we want to call it the woman's livelihood bond, because we are going to use the entire proceeds to invest in women. And just like you had the green bonds become a big momentum, we do need to have people intentionally calling things gender bonds before we're going to see investments at the scale, pace, and urgency as we've seen happen for the climate space. And so our firm, while IIX, the Impact Investment Exchange, does many different things, from research and advisory, impact assessment, and mobilizing capital through many different products and platforms, my team, the Innovative Finance team, was responsible for structuring that first gender bond, which has then won a number of awards for its work. It was a small transaction. When we did the first one, it was 8.5 million. And as someone coming from Wall Street, I was like, well, this is very small, but it's very important that we do it and we show that it can work. But it got the award at the UN General Assembly for climate change. It got awards for running forward a number of the SDGs, which I can talk about later. But it also got recognized as best-in-class ESG, and then just best-in-class bonds in many categories. And I think it was very fascinating. As we built all this momentum, we started issuing these bonds every year. So I think we're on issuance number 5 right now. And these bonds have performed even during the global pandemic. And that's very, very powerful. And this goes back to my point that you always think that if you're investing in women, that's it's the right thing to do, it's a good thing to do, but it's also actually just the smart thing to do. None of the investments that we had any defaults even during 2 years of the pandemic, and that's saying something. You would see global bond prices crash, but these bonds just kept performing the same way. And it's because women actually de-risk the investments because they're so stable. They still repay on time. They still use the money in a very valuable way. And since you're creating actual tangible value by empowering women, huge multi-generational impact, food security impact, so on and so forth. There's so much research that says if you invest in women, we can add another $12 trillion to the global economy. These investments are still performing well on the stock exchange, and in fact have matured without defaults in some cases. So I think for us, we're the world's first structure for gender bond, but we've also done a series of them. And my biggest takeaway is it was a very smart decision to stick with the theme and the focus on using the entire proceeds for investing in women. Tara, you're muted.
Two follow-up questions. Why a bond? Why listing? You could have just done a private markets fund for women. Why was this structure chosen?
That is such an excellent question. So if you look at, when you do these private structures, every time you configure a new one, you have to start from scratch. There's very little track record, and there have been many funds that have focused on women. Predominantly, when we look at the funds that have focused on women, they tend to have a focus of saying, well, we'll put women on boards, or we'll make sure it's a woman CEO that's getting the funding when we look at the company we'll invest in. And that's just not enough anymore. Every single woman, including, myself, we're not women CEOs. And all the millions of women we're trying to empower could be anyone from a farmer to a micro entrepreneur to a woman using a clean cook stove. It could be anything. And so we did want to be more expansive, and we wanted to go beyond the typical ESG checkbox approach of, well, yes, there's a woman on the board. It had to be more than that. And we chose the bond for that structure because it's easy to replicate. Also, once you have an issuance, it can be very, very large in size. Bond issuances can go up to hundreds of millions of dollars at one go. So you can also fight the urgency problem of saying, we can't waste a few years raising money for a fund and then waste a few more years deploying that money. Bonds get structured in 6 to 12 months, get listed, mobilize millions of dollars, get deployed within a matter of days in some cases, which is very compelling. And the reason we listed it is, one, of course, there's the liquidity angle, but bonds don't trade that much. It's more the credibility angle. A lot of investors feel very comforted by the fact that this is a secure product. We've had, I believe 10 law firms have looked at it. Luckily, most of them have done pro bono work. 3 very large banks have KYC'd it. So it's an actual financial product. Everybody working on the team has worked in Wall Street at some point. So it's actually using a very strong financial product, but for a change, using the proceeds entirely for good. And when you list such a thing, it gives a lot of very large scale investors the ability to come in. We've had trillion-dollar funds from the US, microfinance investment vehicles from Europe, family offices from Hong Kong and New Zealand, super funds come in from the Pacific, and it attracts a very wide universe. And we think we need to do that. We can't keep going back to the same few people who believe in gender equality. This needs to be mainstream at this point in 2022. I think you're muted again.
Why do I do this? Have you seen any ripple effects in the ecosystem from this?
Yeah, I think, when we started doing this, of course, when you start doing anything new, people will kind of think you're crazy, which is always when you're onto something interesting. And when the minute it works, you'll see a lot more people talking about it. And, we were very happy to be one of the first people doing it. But I have noticed in particular over the last 15 to 18 months, especially since the pandemic broke out and there was more and more papers about the state of women and the rise of gender-based violence, which is truly terrible and horrific during the pandemic. The need to have more such issuances, more gender bonds. I've seen we've contributed to a number of different papers on the issue. We have just launched an orange bond initiative. The way you have the green bonds, orange is the color of UN SDG 5. Which stands for gender equality. So we have just launched an orange bond initiative. I think it's gone live today because it's International Women's Day. And so that's very exciting. And we want to make sure that the same way you have market standards for climate bonds, you should now have market standards for gender bonds so more people can do it. And we've got a lot of momentum behind that, which is very exciting. We don't want to be the only ones doing gender bonds.
So you see this being replicated?
Replicated, scaled, multi-continent, lots of sectors. I think there's no bounds because women are everywhere in every continent, and we don't want this to be the kind of security which has any sort of real or artificial boundaries.
And speaking of which, the SDGs, How do you see this linking to the other SDGs outside of SDG 5 for gender equality, including but not limited to climate action, including anything that you all do to measure or any learnings you've had on these synergies?
So we had the great pleasure to work very closely with the United Nations on a couple of issuances, and on the second and third issuances in the series. So we aligned with, I think, 14 SDGs, which is great. When you empower a woman, you do see this ripple effect of problems she's able to solve when she's financially secure herself. Multi-generational impact. We saw SDG 2 and SDG 3, which is food security and better health, a ripple effect directly on the children. We saw huge improvements in safety of the women and reduced income inequalities. So I think that's SDG 10 as well, that was affected, in SDG 16, which is peace and justice. And then finally, we saw climate change. And this has been probably the most fascinating one. The last bond we did focused very intentionally on climate change. So we had a $30 million issuances, out of which a third of that capital actually went to proactively making sure that women are part of the climate solution. This is through mitigation, access to clean energy, which is very, very important, but also through adaptation. 2/3 of the world's food is grown by women smallholder farmers, and we consume that food. But a large portion of these food supply chains are getting affected by climate change. So when you do invest in women smallholder farmers and they're more financially resilient, many of them first will invest in making sure that they can stabilize their crops, and that has a ripple effect on all of us, whether we realize it or not. So the stronger the women farmers are, who are the backbone of food security for almost 2/3 the world, that's a direct link with many of us as well.
And I know IIX, I mean, as I said, very pioneering. I even did my innovative finance certification with you guys. I'd love to see any other financial innovations you all have seen lately or are working on that you see as being transformative towards triple bottom line, with an emphasis on gender for International Women's Day.
I do think the whole orange bond as an asset class will be very interesting to see how that evolves. Once you do have an orange bond as an asset class, you will have a set of principles and standards. And I think that's very important to really put a stake into the ground of what does it actually mean to invest in women. And we see this as very threefold. Firstly, of course, you use the proceeds, not just to invest in companies where women are on the boards, works very well in the global West. But if you're looking at certain regions like Africa and Asia, maybe you look at the products and services of those companies or the employees of those companies or the supply chains and see if they're disproportionately affecting and benefiting women. I'd also say that with the orange bonds, looking at the leadership, are people who are taking the investment decisions women? Are there enough women of color taking those decisions? Do they bring that context? People who are writing all the papers and designing the standards, are there women? And again, women of color there. And these are the hard conversations we have to ask ourselves, because people have been doing gender lens investing for a very long time, but it's been dominated by a very small group. And how do we make that group more inclusive? We also need men to be part of the conversation. We also need women from the global South to be a part of the conversation. And we need to listen very closely to people who've worked on women's rights issues as well. And finally, on the measurement side, and this is very fascinating, I think the best thing that we did for the Women's Livelihood Bond, and the reason we won a number of the awards I mentioned, is while we're even constructing the portfolio of companies which we are going to invest in through the bond, we actually go not just doing a very good and in-depth credit due diligence on every company, we actually do an impact due diligence where we speak to the women in the supply chain. I have spent time sieving rice in Cambodia. I've gone to India and seen people who pick marigold. I've been in Sri Lanka with microfinance entities, in Philippines, companies that sell clean cook stove to low-income women, and hearing their stories of how the proceeds affect their lives has been so important for us to make the right decisions. Because I think, unfortunately, the reason the world hasn't ever really managed to solve poverty is because we don't ask the people who are experiencing poverty what they really need on the ground. And I unfortunately think we are sometimes making the same mistake with gender equality. It's people in positions of privilege who are trying to solve this, and none of us have enough context. And it's very important for us to get data and insights from these women who are much more resilient than many of us, and learn from them and see how do we use the proceeds in ways they think is most beneficial. Our first bond almost entirely focused on financial inclusion of women. Well, like if they have access to money, that's it, right? But our second one realized that no, they want savings products, they want insurance products. Our third one realized no, we have to invest in women in agriculture. Fourth one, we decided clean energy needs to be there because we're constantly hearing from the women. So a data-driven, women-centric approach is very critical. And I think that's the true innovation that we've created through the WLB, and hopefully we'll be able to do through the Orange Bonds.
Is how visible, how transparent are you with the data? Like, is this also part of the selling point to investors? Because it's a listed product, but because you're going so deep with impact? And if that is part of the unique selling point, how do you package it in a way that's also time efficient and reasonable for you all?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Tara. So I think it is the biggest selling point. I think, of course, we have a very innovative structure. It's guaranteed by the U.S. government, and the other side of innovation is risk. So I will call that out, is that the fact that it's secured by the U.S. government with a 50% guarantee plays a very big role. But in addition to that, once people know their money will be relatively safe, they still want to see not just that financial return, which has been proven to be stable, but that very distinct impact return. So we do what's called a social return on investment analysis. I actually learned this when I was at Oxford, how to do an SROI calculation in Professor Nichols' class. So shout out to him if he's there. Excellent class, by the way. And we still use SROI. So we know for every dollar, we're creating roughly $4 of social value, because it's not a grant, it's an investment that's going to have a multiplier effect. So calculating that has been really fascinating. We do semi-annual reports to investors. These reports don't just have the SROI, they have links to the SDGs. They comply with the International Capital Markets Association social bond principles, so we get a certification from there. And then we back it up, which I think is the heart of all of this, with the interview data from the women saying, and during COVID, this has been truly fascinating. There are times we even did not meet certain target outcomes that we said, we think women will increase income by, 15 to 20% in a certain geography. But during COVID, that didn't happen. And even though we reported, just because we were so transparent saying it didn't happen because of COVID. However, we're seeing women who are buying water filters instead, and they're avoiding healthcare costs. We're seeing women who are buying more climate resilient seeds, and we think that's going to help the future of climate. And so I think investors aren't so hell-bent on meeting targets you met. They want to see how transparent you are, how in touch you are with the women, how secure the financial investment is, and how that actually links to the security on the social side as well. So I would actually advocate for a lot more transparency in this space, because I think we underestimate how reasonable investors can be, especially during difficult times, and how it helps to be very just honest with what you're doing. The biggest bane of our existence in the impact space is the incredible amount of greenwashing and impact washing that's happening. When I sit, as you mentioned, on the ICMA social bond working group for impact reporting. So I lead that along with another investor. And I think every year we struggle with this. How do we make sure issuers are just being more transparent with what happened with the money? Because that's the only way we can learn and make better investment decisions in the future. If billions of dollars are going into these bonds, the social, green, and sustainable bonds raised just over $800 billion last year. And yet this is the state of the world. We're clearly doing something wrong, and we need to hold ourselves more accountable.
Makes a lot of sense. And were there any other organizations that have had financial innovations with a triple bottom line that you see as being exemplary in terms of their gender impact?
So I think interestingly, I've seen, of course, a lot of the banks are doing a wonderful job at pushing out these kind of issuances and supporting others like us also doing them. But I think what we often forget is with innovative finance, it's always you're matching demand and supply. And one of the best ways to do that is really to address the risk issue, because that is the main deterrent of why people will or will not invest. The donor agencies, I think some of them, like USAID, DFC, the Development Finance Corporation of the United States government, the Swedish government, and I believe a couple of others, Proparco, I believe as well, all have guarantee facilities. And that's a fantastic way to use public sector funding, not to invest, but just to come in just as a guarantor to say, if something goes wrong, we will step in. for a portion of the losses. That alone, even though, for instance, we have a guarantee from DFC, we've never actually used the guarantee, but we have access to it. It's allowed us to leverage in multiple times amount of capital from the private sector. And I think that's where we really need to start being innovative, things like that. So I think guarantee facilities by the donor agencies have been a truly incredible financial innovation because they help leverage in several times more capital from these massive investors, from, like I said, trillion-dollar funds to super funds, pension funds, microfinance investment vehicles, which collectively control the $100 trillion bond market.
In doing the investor relations for the WLB, was this their actual, input that, thank goodness you have the guarantee? Like when you were interacting with all of these asset owners, and I'd love to hear also how it changed over time as you developed the track record. What made it so that it was able to capture more and more of this kind of capital? Was it the impact story? Was it the transparency? What were the parts of the secret sauce that you think were key, but also how did they change over time?
Yeah, so it was a constant balance between three dimensions. There's risk and return always, but risk return impact in this case. So constantly having to balance was very critical. If we would remove even one, we would instantly see investors pull out. So we decided we would always retain the guarantee piece, at least for the first several years when we're building track record. We've been around since 2017 doing these bonds, but that's still not very long in the grand scheme of things of financial markets. The guarantee piece has been a nice stable element. What we have done is every year bring the return down to say, well, it should be a risk adjusted return. You're seeing we're not having defaults, so we're going to lower the return on a financial scale. And that helps people say that there should not be a gender penalty on the return side. Just because you're investing in women, you don't really need to have a higher return, because you should factor in the risk in a better way because you're seeing that there are no defaults. So without removing the guarantee, you can lower that return, and you can use that capital to give better rates to the companies who you're investing in, and that trickles down to the women. We think that's more powerful than just removing the guarantee and getting the same kind of return from investors. We'd rather focus on the women first. But yes, I think the other compelling story, once people feel their investment is safe and they're like, all right, it's a coupon that we think is reasonable, whether or not they'll come in really does depend on the impact. And I think people like the fact that we're complying with all these global standards, ICMA, SDGs, so on and so forth. But I feel like the human side, like when we're actually able to, when I tell them stories of what the women have told me, the rice farmers, I remember when I was talking to one of these rice farmers in Cambodia, and she's selling organic rice, and we're like, do you feel like you have more decision-making power, et cetera, et cetera. And what she really was saying is she saw herself, like I've been saying, not as a victim, but as a solution. She's like, well, because of me, people have rice to eat. Because of me, my kids are going to go to school for longer, including my daughter. I'm breaking the cycle that's for centuries has not been broken by women in my family. And so it's very powerful to see those stories of transformation, to share them with investors, because I think many people do want to see that capital to be put to good use. And the fact that we have visibility on how that capital is used is the most powerful de-risker of all. If we didn't actually have those conversations with women before we deployed capital, if it was the old school M&E when you report after the project is done, we actually wouldn't be able to make the right investment decisions as well. We spend a lot of time deciding who will go in or out, and that's the greatest power of having women in and making sure that they are playing a role in mitigating the risk and stabilizing the return while deepening the impact.
When you say if this were old school M&E, how would it be different?
So I think a lot of the some of the bonds that get issued don't do so much upfront work. They would have expectations, they would raise a certain amount of funds, and then on a retrospective basis, they would report what kind of impact there was. Whereas if you're taking a forward-looking approach, you need to speak to people on the ground saying, have you worked with these companies before? How is this going to change your life? What are you going to use the proceeds for? And then you do a forward-looking projection. So you have some sort of accountability. What are you holding yourselves to? And then you're also able to drop or keep in companies, because there are many times when the women will say, well, it's not actually making that much of a difference. And then we can go back to the company saying, we don't think you're ready yet. This is what we've heard from the women. And this is the most powerful way to shift power dynamics back to people on the ground, by holding companies accountable and saying, women in your supply chain are saying X. So while your credit story is wonderful and you're very secure, we're not seeing it translate to those women on the ground. They need a fairer price, et cetera, et cetera. So we're using the capital to become advocates, to build gender action plans for these companies and to change the system. It's very easy to keep lending to, microfinance entities, but we should be lending to women who are not just going to borrow $100 to buy a cow, but really start building them on that journey where they're going to own their own dairy farm eventually. And for that, you need to have those conversations with the women.
So is that what might be in the sixth iteration?
So the sixth iteration, the fifth iteration, which is going up, I think will definitely align with the orange bond standards when those get finalized. But I think one of the most important elements we'll keep in there that we've tried in previous iterations is climate. I just don't see how the world is going to move forward and transition to zero carbon if we don't have half of humanity as part of that solution. So I think that's the biggest feature that we're seeing will retain and be maybe an integral part of all women's Soviet bond issuances going forward, is seeing women also as part of a bigger planetary solution.
And over the past 2 years, especially, there's been this huge uptick in ESG. And with all of the ESG funds and standards and labels, how has this affected you're doing the women's life? Has it brought any benefit? Has it brought mostly additional work? How has that affected this whole landscape for WLB, but also for the broader gender lens investment ecosystem?
Yeah, it's funny because I was looking the other day, there've been about 100 articles and blog posts on gender lens investing, about 25 different panels and conferences on investing in women, and about 3 to 5 guidelines, somewhere in between. I don't know if 2 of them are published yet, on what does it mean to do a gender bond. And I think all of this is great, but I think we're spending so much time talking about it, and so much of the funding that people are putting into this, foundations, governments, etc., who fund these kind of things, are funding people to write about something that we've already, I think for a while now, have understood is important. I think it's time we focus on transactions. It's time we focus on mobilizing capital. It's time we fund things that develop more innovative structures or support replication, because we are out of time, whether it be the peace argument or the climate argument or even the COVID recovery argument. All of this is a lot more urgent than it was 5 years ago. So it's a bit passé now for us to keep talking about it, which is why, again, with the orange bonds, we want to set clear standards, but also have clear transactions coming out of it, advisory support, certification, verification abilities, tools, practical guidelines, etc. So it's more focused on how do you get transactions out there, as opposed to how do you talk about why it's important to invest in women. I think everyone has understood that it is important.
They have understood that it's important. Do you feel that any of these, the labels and the systems that are getting more and more ground, are they making it easier to do this, or are they making it harder, or are they just making it harder to see?
Yeah, I think some of the labels are really well done. I do like the ICMA social bond principles. I think it's very thoughtful. They have a lot of other additional guidance documents that goes out. And I think they're in some ways it's good because they're very broad, so they're very easy to comply with. So for us, for instance, we didn't do anything different when the ICMA social bond principles came out. We already complied with them because we're already very deep on the impact side. I think it's more a shift for maybe banks who are doing more traditional bonds, and then they want to make it a social bond, so they have to change a few things. For us, it wasn't much of a shift. We also comply with 2X. Didn't change anything. We were just informed that we comply, which was nice. I think you have to have a certain number of women in your investment committee. Your proceeds have to disproportionately impact women. So a lot of the standards, if you're already doing it in a very deep way, are easy to comply with. So we haven't had a problem with them. What I do think for gender is we need a more specific set of guidelines on what does it mean to do a gender bond, because it's very different to do gender lens investing in different through a fund or through another structure. Whereas if you're doing an actual bond transaction, it's a different type of financial security, and it should, like I said, look at everything from who's making investment decisions to how proceeds are used to how proceeds are eventually reported on, and having standards that hold you accountable across that lens, I think will have much more transformative impact and lasting impact, than just saying, oh, well, as long as you have 3 women on the board of this organization, you're good. You've ticked this box. It's very some of the standards are very checkbox, and I don't think that's going to actually create change at the pace and scale we need to create change.
I totally agree. And on that note, obviously the MLB is emblematic of this, and you are emblematic of this, and your founder, Doreen Shanaz, is emblematic of this. But I'd love to hear, even beyond MLB, in your organization, how have you built in this ethos for gender equity in the business model and or operations?
That's an excellent question. So I think it's nice that when I was at Oxford, I was looking around for a job in the impact investing space, and it was incredibly hard to find anything that was an organization led by women of color. You just didn't see that many, and this was like what it's almost impossible. It was like 8 years ago. And firstly, I wanted to switch from the Wall Street and hedge fund life to impact investing. And I was like, there's going to be plenty of women, right? And there were. There's a lot of women involved in it. But again, I think that intersectionality of women and a person of color, very rare. That too at the CEO level, even more rare. So when I heard of the work that Professor Shanaz was doing here in Asia, I thought that's just incredible. And so that for me was the starting point. The DNA of the firm, I think most of the senior executives, our CIO is the only white man, and he's the minority in the senior group. And that's a nice change from someone who had worked on Wall Street, mostly with white men. So for me, the fact that he's the minority in our company is truly fascinating. But then I think, yeah, it trickles down to all our products and services. It's, the Women's Ivy Bond, I'm very fortunate to work on that. But many of my colleagues I've seen have gender considerations built into whatever product service they're doing as well. So that there's that inherent DNA in the company that gender needs to be looked at and taken very seriously in all our decisions, which is very nice, very refreshing.
So for every potential investment or advisory project, there's some kind of gender assessment to ensure that it's at the very least not detracting and hopefully contributing.
Exactly. I remember there was this paper on blue investments and investing in fisheries, and most fishery reports, you can look at it will always say fishermen, 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 and we're like, fishers or fishermen and fisherwomen. It's small things like that, because we were like, why aren't we interviewing the women in the supply chain? So it was small things like that, like so intentionally done, which I think is so incredible and so important in today's world, where an entire gender is sometimes forgotten in complete supply chains. So that fisheries report, I remember, really blew my mind, because it's a lot of a lot of people positioned it, oh, the wives of the fishermen actually do the selling, and we're like, no, they're just women who are part of the supply chain. We don't have to make them the wives of anyone. So it's changing those dynamics, even in a sector like fisheries, where people just think it's all about actually solving the problem with the fish, but having just because we are IIX, we spotted that out immediately, and we're like, no, we need to actually change this. And this was some very large environmental NGOs working on that project. And they were like, oh yeah, we've just never thought of it that way. So it's nice to see that we have that. It just comes so naturally to everyone who works at IIX. And that's a small example.
That's a really good example. And another angle to it, which you pointed out, was the not just integrating the consideration of gender equity, but doing so with an intersectional lens. And any thoughts on how you all do that from a business model and operations perspective? As you know, the OXIFIED Fireside Chat series, that's part of what we're looking at. All aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And part of it also includes these clinics, and these fireside chats are almost kind of like inputs for a clinic as far as what should organizations, startups that are led by students on campus be thinking about as far as how would they build in an intersectional, gender equitable approach.
I think it's really important to have women from the countries you're investing in be a part of the investment decision-making process, or the structuring process and the reporting process. And we do that very well. We make sure that we have women from those countries on our teams. And where we can't have that or don't have that, we work with organizations and partners on the ground, and we speak to the women within those organizations, which has been, I think, a very rewarding part of the work. To make sure that we have cultural context as well. A lot of the issues we're trying to change is in deeply patriarchal communities, and it has to be handled very sensitively. And no matter how much money you throw at the problem, some of these issues are not going to go away overnight. So to understand more deeply what's going on, I think it's always critical to have women from those countries. And this extends even to the US. We were I think in 2018, I was working on a project with the Medtronic Foundation on healthcare financing in the United States. And a lot of my work eventually centered on maternal care. And we saw that if you're a woman of color, you're 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than if you are a white woman in New York, which is crazy. Somewhere that I've lived and worked and just never knew that. So then making sure that when we had developed a whole toolkit for impact measurement for women's health, we had a lot of women of color and patients who were people of color, frontline health workers who were people of color, feed into that and say, what do we actually need to measure so we can change this? Because what you measure ends up being what you end up funding. And if the people who are picking those metrics are not people of color themselves, women or otherwise, I think you become very detached from what you're trying to solve.
It's funny because earlier in the chat, you mentioned this data-driven, intersectional, equality-driven approach. And as you keep giving examples, the picture gets clear that is very much indeed the case. And that comes from leadership. So I'd love to hear any lessons learned about what leadership should look like to build an inclusive and equitable organizations, both the things that you are doing as a leader and also the things that you've learned from your organization that others could learn from.
I think leadership needs to have very strong sounding boards, because one person will never have enough experiences to solve some of the kind of problems that you try to solve in the impact investing space, whether it's poverty or inequality or climate change or peace building. These are very complex issues, and they're so interconnected in a world like this. So having a sounding board of people across countries, like I've said, making sure the global south, etc., are a part of it. Across races and cultures, again, people of color. You may have people from the global south who are based in the global south and live there, but again, if you're a person of color, you may have felt certain kinds of discrimination that would give you different kinds of perspectives, but also just different stakeholder groups. So for instance, when the green bond standards were built initially, it was built by a group of banks, basically. And that could be why the green bond standards were so broad that Cicero had to eventually come out with the shades of green, the very famous shades of green. So you could have a green bond, which they said, well, this is a very deep green bond, which meant it actually has very tangible impact on the environment. And then they would politely say, this is a light green bond, which means not so much substantial or lasting impact. And I think in recent years, the Green Bond Committee has then started including lawyers, people from donor agencies, UN bodies, etc., to give a wide variety of perspectives from different sectors to say, we understand it's a financial product, but you have to get many different opinions to see how you're going to solve it, because people have different touch points with what the issue is, and will therefore have a deeper understanding of where capital needs to be deployed and how it can be used. So I think those 3 lenses of having people of different continents, people of different races, of course, gender goes without saying, and then finally, people from different sectors is so critical that I don't think any of this can be solved unless it's a multi-stakeholder solution. And that's the kind of sounding board that leaders need. So even with us, when we do consultations or we seek advisors, we keep all of these lenses in mind. A lot of the, for instance, even the gender standards that are being built, you'll see it'll be, when you look at the advisory committees, it'll be dominated with a particular set of people, maybe all from donor agencies, maybe all women, which may seem great, but maybe you do want a few men in there, which may seem counterintuitive. And maybe they're all from the global West. And that's maybe why half the world feels that they've been left out of, say, the entire feminist movement as well. That was the big critique for the three waves of feminism. The fourth and the fifth wave became much more adherent to that because parallel movements like Black Lives Matter had started by then. And so I do think keeping those multi-pronged lens in mind is the best way you can be an informed and intentional leader in the space.
And then my final question, and it's super open, is advice for others, fellow Oxford MBAs, fellow Oxonians, aspiring impact investors, aspiring gender lens investors. What is your advice for those who want to leave their mark in a way that also can advance gender equity? And this, where to begin, what to prioritize, anything that you've learned?
Yeah, I think the first thing would be to be very audacious about it. This is probably one of the most complicated things you're going to join. There's a lot of pushback you should expect. None of this is going to be as easy as it sounds. It sounds very exciting and glamorous, but you'll get pushback from anyone who stands to lose, which is everyone who's in a position of power or privilege. And so you will get subtle forms of pushback. So you have to have that very centered approach to why you want to do this, because you have a long road ahead and you need a lot of internal locus of control to be able to push forward. There's a beautiful Japanese concept called ikigai, and it's the nexus of 4 different things. It's what you're good at, what you can get paid for so you can sustain what you're good at, what you love doing, and what the world needs. And when you have the nexus of these 4, it's your ikigai, which is your, in French, your raison d'être, or in plain English, it's your purpose. And I think when you look at whatever way you're going to solve gender equality, you should make sure it hits all 4 of those pieces, because then you'll be able to do it in a lasting way that's rewarding for you and probably has a more long-term effect on the world.
And you gave a shout out to Alex Nichols' course, but are there any other shout outs as far as resources that people should be picking up? Oh, actually, there's a follow-up question. 1 to 2 key resources. Oh, we're aligned. Or tools that you would recommend, especially to those who are just starting out in gender lens investing or gender bonds specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put the link for, I think I have a whole list of these actually. So orange bond standards, I can share the orange bond standards, the orange bond initiative link. I'm just trying to pull it up. So that'll be one, although it's just got announced, so there's not a lot up there right now. But apart from that, I would say there's a few, if you just want to read, there's a number of books here that I probably should recommend. If you have more of an international relations focus, there's Women, Peace and Security, which is a fantastic book by Professor Johnson Fries, Joan Johnson Fries. So I would definitely recommend that one. There is an entire set of books on gender lens investing that came out with some very senior executives from Bank of America, which is the basics of what you should do. And then if you look at ICMA's social bond principles, there's an entire set of resources on impact measurement, which is actually really well done. We've worked very hard on it with about, I think, 40 other ecosystem players. So a lot of people have fed into that. And that has a lot of flavors of what you would measure, both in terms of gender, but also in terms of many other SDGs and other areas. So ICMA social bond principles, look for the impact investing section. I can send all these links to Tara later, and she can share them more broadly with everyone. But there's a whole set of resources there, because you also have to be able to then measure and report on whatever you're doing.
Correct. Well, that's it's just been a treasure trove of information. I'm so delighted by and proud of you for being involved with this WLB, it's pioneering and historical. And I hope it gets replicated and scaled a lot. I hope we see hundreds of these in our lifetime. And I'm also looking forward to hearing more about the other innovations that you all will come up with across the other SDGs, and continuing to drive the synergies with SDG 5, and continuing to learn and educate us all in the process. So unless there's any further questions from the rest of the audience, I just wanted to thank you, Natasha, for joining us today, everything you've shared with us, and congratulate you on it and your team at IIX, and also to wish you a happy Women's Day.
Happy Women's Day to you as well. Thank you so much, Tara.
Thank you, everyone.